Millionaire leaves the safe open to put the poor daughter of the maid to the test. But while he watched in secret, he saw something that left him in shock. The Beaumont estate stood like a relic from another age, hidden behind towering iron gates and manicured hedges that stretched toward the sky like guards sworn to secrecy. Nestled deep in the wooded heart of Connecticut, the mansion was more than just a home, it was a symbol of legacy, power, and silence. Its many windows gleamed like cold eyes watching over a property that pulsed with stories never told aloud. Eleanor Myers had grown up in the shadows of that grand house. At 17, she knew every crack in the garden's stone path, every creak in the servants' stairwell, and every scent that floated from the kitchens in the early morning. Her mother, Grace, had worked for the Beaumonts since Eleanor was 6 years old. They lived in a modest cottage tucked behind the orchard, a quiet place where the humming of insects filled the silence left by absent conversations. Grace was a woman of few words but infinite discipline. She carried herself with a dignity that made even the other staff pause when she walked into a room. Over the years, she'd risen from laundress to the trusted housekeeper of the Beaumont estate, a position she held with an almost religious devotion. Eleanor often wondered what it was like for her mother to serve people who barely remembered the birthdays of those who cleaned their silverware. But Grace never complained. She believed in duty, in survival. Eleanor, on the other hand, believed in questions. She had a mind that moved faster than her mouth, a hunger for books and a quiet curiosity that often made her seem distant. She studied at a public school in town, walking nearly 3 miles each day just to avoid the stares of the Beaumonts' private driver. She didn't belong to their world, but she lived close enough to feel its weight pressing against her life like a pane of glass, always there, always separating. The patriarch of the family, Mr. Charles Beaumont, rarely spoke to Eleanor. A man of 62, he moved through his estate like a ghost in pressed suits and polished shoes, never raising his voice, never repeating himself. To the staff, he was a man to be feared and obeyed. To the world, he was a financial titan, founder of a billion-dollar asset management firm, known for ruthless decisions and zero tolerance for sentimentality. Rumors swirled about how he built his empire, about the fallouts with competitors, and the distant brother he no longer mentioned. Charles had no wife, not anymore. She had died years earlier in a car accident that the town still whispered about. His children, 2 sons from a previous marriage, lived across the country and barely visited. The only constant in his life now was the house and the people who maintained it. Among them, Grace was the only one he trusted without question. Her silence, her discipline, her loyalty, these things comforted him more than the empty conversations of boardrooms. And then there was Eleanor. Though he would never admit it, Charles had observed her from afar for years. He watched her through the reflection of his study window as she walked with her books, through security cameras in the garden, through reports from other staff. He found her restraint curious, her posture familiar. She didn't flinch under his gaze. She didn't ask for more than what she was given. And still, something about her unsettled him, like a puzzle with one piece just slightly out of place. It was a rainy evening in early autumn when the idea of a test first entered his mind. He had been reviewing financial statements when he saw Eleanor through the study window, helping the gardener gather fallen branches near the fountain. Her sleeves were rolled, hair tied back, face turned upward into the rain. She didn't look like someone trying to impress anyone. She looked honest. Real. And yet, Charles didn't believe in honesty, not without motive. Everyone had a price. Even the purest hearts could be bought if you found the right currency. What, then, was Eleanor's price? That night, while the rain tapped against the high windows and the fireplace burned low, Charles summoned his head butler and gave precise instructions. No one was to mention the coffer in the study. No one was to interfere when Eleanor was assigned to clean there. The cameras were to be turned on, discreetly, and left recording. And above all, the safe, the large steel door tucked behind the oil painting of the orchard, was to be left ajar. Not wide open, he clarified coldly. Just enough to tempt. He dismissed the butler with a wave and returned to his chair. For a long moment, he stared into the fire, lost in thought. He told himself this was a test of curiosity, of integrity. But beneath that cold logic was a deeper truth he wasn't ready to name, a tension that had grown over time, rooted in the unshakable sense that Eleanor was more than just Grace's daughter. More than just a girl sweeping dust from the edges of his empire. He did not know yet that the test he devised would unravel far more than he intended. Outside, the rain fell harder. The cameras had already begun to record. He waited. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the rain had faded to a faint mist that clung to the leaves like dew. The mansion stood silent, as always, but something imperceptible had shifted within its walls. Orders had been given. Instructions followed. And a game had begun, one that only one man knew was being played. Eleanor awoke to her usual routine. The cottage where she and Grace lived was still wrapped in the gray hush of morning, and the warmth from the kitchen stove barely reached the narrow hallway where she tied her boots. Her mother had already left for her daily rounds in the main house, and Eleanor knew she was expected shortly afterward. She braided her hair in front of the small mirror nailed to the back of her bedroom door and threw on her faded cardigan, the one with one pocket slightly torn but still stitched closed with care. She didn't yet know that today she would be sent somewhere she had never been allowed to go before. When she arrived at the main house, the butler met her with his usual stiff nod. "You'll be cleaning the study today," he said, his voice devoid of emotion, as if it were any other room. Eleanor hesitated for the briefest of moments, the weight of those words settling inside her. The study had always been off-limits. Not just for her, but for everyone except Mr. Beaumont himself and a select few. "Yes, sir," she replied simply, masking her curiosity with quiet obedience. As she walked through the long hallway toward the heart of the house, her footsteps muffled by the thick rugs, the stillness around her deepened. Oil paintings stared from the walls, solemn ancestors with names she didn't know and expressions as severe as the man who owned the estate. She passed the library and the dining hall, both cavernous and empty, and finally reached the double doors of the study. Her hand hovered on the brass handle. For a moment, she looked up, as if sensing something unseen. But the hallway was empty. The study greeted her with the faint smell of leather, tobacco, and wood polish. The room was vast, with tall bookshelves lining the walls, 2 leather armchairs near a dying fireplace, and a massive mahogany desk at the center. Behind it, a wall-length window overlooked the orchard, its trees cloaked in the mist of the lingering morning fog. But what caught her attention immediately wasn't the grandeur or the warmth of the room. It was the painting. The oil painting that had always been rumored to hide something, now shifted slightly, revealing the edge of a steel door behind it. The safe. It wasn't locked. It wasn't even closed. She didn't move at first. Her fingers clenched the handle of her cleaning cart, her eyes fixed on the metal edge peeking from behind the frame. Her heart beat louder than the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the corner. She knew she hadn't done anything wrong, but the open vault felt like a trap. Something deliberate. Something that did not belong in her path. She took a step forward, pushing the cart gently, the wheels muffled against the Persian rug. She forced herself to look away from the safe, to begin her task as assigned. Dusting the bookshelves. Wiping the window ledge. Shaking out the rug near the fireplace. But the presence of that open vault hummed in the background like a silent alarm. Her eyes kept drifting back. And then she saw what was inside. Stacks of bills, thick bundles wrapped in paper bands. Velvet boxes left slightly ajar, revealing the gleam of gold and sapphire. A necklace draped over the edge of one shelf. She recognized it. She'd once seen it on Mrs. Beaumont in an old photo that sat in the hallway. Worth tens of thousands, at least. She did not approach. Instead, Eleanor turned to the desk. Her hands moved in practiced motions, dusting the surface, arranging the inkwell and blotter with mechanical care. That was when she noticed the sheet of paper lying half-folded beneath a leather-bound notebook. It was yellowed with age, torn across the center, and bore handwriting that looked rushed, perhaps even desperate. She hadn't meant to read it. But her eyes couldn't help catching the first line. "To Grace, if anything happens to me, this must not be forgotten." She froze. Her hands trembled as she slid the paper free from under the notebook. It was only half a letter, torn clean through the middle, but the message was clear enough. Phrases stood out like sudden bursts of light. Regret I never spoke, Eleanor must one day know, this house owes more than I can repay. And at the bottom, barely legible, 2 initials. LM. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She looked toward the door, but the hall was still empty. She stared at the torn letter again, the words blurring through the rising heat behind her eyes. Her fingers tightened around the paper. She didn't know what this was, not entirely, but something told her it mattered. Deeply. And not just to her mother. For one split second, the thought crossed her mind, take the letter. Hide it. Show her mother. Ask questions. But she didn't. Instead, she folded it carefully, placed it back exactly where she'd found it, and turned away from the desk. Her heart raced as she moved toward the door, abandoning the cart, the duster still in her hand. She didn't look back. She didn't stop walking until she had exited the study and rounded the corner toward the service wing. She passed the butler without a word. He didn't ask why she looked pale, or why she didn't finish cleaning. Maybe he didn't notice. Or maybe he had been told to say nothing. From behind the study's paneled walls, a monitor flickered in the dim light of a hidden room. Charles Beaumont sat alone, eyes fixed on the grainy footage of Eleanor in his study. He had watched her from the moment she entered, every glance, every pause, every breath. But it wasn't her restraint in the face of money that had held him captive. It was the look on her face when she found the letter. The recognition. The pain. And most of all, the way her lips had moved in a whisper when she held the torn paper. He had replayed the moment again and again, slowing it down. Just enough to see it clearly. She had said one word. Barely audible, even without sound. Father. Charles sat back in his chair, blood drained from his face, the weight of his own test collapsing in on him like the walls of a house built on secrets. And for the first time in years, he did not feel like the one in control. The rest of the day passed in a haze. Eleanor barely spoke a word, even to her mother, who noticed immediately that something was wrong. At dinner, Grace studied her daughter's pale face and distant eyes. The silence between them was tense, but Eleanor didn't offer an explanation. Not yet. She needed time to understand what she had seen, and more importantly, what she now suspected. That night, she lay in bed for hours, her mind unraveling the image of the letter again and again. The way it was signed. The tone of the words. The mention of her mother. The unfinished thoughts. A truth felt close, too close, like the sharp edge of something buried just beneath the surface, threatening to cut through if touched. In the mansion, Charles remained in his private quarters, the surveillance footage still playing on a loop in his mind. Every time he saw Eleanor hold the letter, every time he saw her lips form that word, Father, it stirred something deep and unwelcome in him. He wanted to believe it was coincidence. A misunderstanding. But the way she had fled the room, shaken to her core, told him otherwise. She had recognized something. He rose early the next morning, well before the staff began their routines, and entered the study with deliberate steps. The room was exactly as it had been left. The safe still open, the valuables untouched. The letter still half hidden beneath the notebook. He lifted it. Read it again. And knew, without question, that he had made a mistake. It was time to act, carefully. Later that morning, Eleanor was surprised to find her usual list of cleaning duties missing. Instead, the butler approached her with a quiet message. Mr. Beaumont would like you to clean the library today. The library? That wasn't unusual, she had cleaned it before. But something in the way the butler delivered the message made her pause. He avoided eye contact. His voice was more formal than usual, as if afraid of saying too much. Eleanor nodded and made her way through the west corridor toward the library, her thoughts still clouded with unanswered questions. She entered the vast room lined with old, leather-bound volumes and dusty wooden shelves. The scent of parchment and history clung to the air. Sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows in long streaks of color across the floor. She began her work in silence, dusting and organizing. But within minutes, she sensed something, or someone, behind her. She turned. Mr. Beaumont stood near the doorway, his hands clasped behind his back. "I hope the study wasn't too overwhelming yesterday," he said, his voice low, carefully measured. Eleanor straightened her posture, unsure how to respond. He had never addressed her directly like this, at least, not in such a calm and personal tone. "It was fine, sir," she said, cautious. He walked further into the room, his footsteps echoing lightly across the hardwood. He paused beside a shelf filled with encyclopedias and ran his fingers along the spines. "There are very few people I trust to enter that room," he continued. "You handled it well." Eleanor's heart pounded. She watched him closely, unsure if this was praise or a trap. He turned to her suddenly. "Did anything unusual catch your attention while you were there?" She swallowed. "I didn't touch anything, sir." "That's not what I asked." There was a silence between them, deep and dense. "I saw a letter," she said finally. "It was already out. I read it." "I'm sorry." Charles didn't react. His expression remained neutral, but his eyes, sharp, unblinking, studied her. "And what did you make of it?" She hesitated. "It wasn't complete. But it sounded like it was meant for my mother. From someone named LM. "I see." He didn't speak for several seconds. Then, in a tone that was strangely soft, almost curious, he asked, "Do you know who LM might be?" Eleanor met his gaze, and for the first time in her life, she didn't look away. "I think I do," she said. "But I don't think I'm supposed to." A flicker passed through Charles's eyes, something that might have been pain, or guilt, or perhaps just recognition of what was inevitable. He gave her a short nod. "That letter should not have been where you found it," he said. "But it was." He turned and walked toward the door. Before leaving, he added without looking back, "When you're finished here, come to the East Wing. I want to show you something." The East Wing. Eleanor's hands trembled as she returned to her task. That part of the house had been closed for years, ever since the death of Mr. Beaumont's brother, Louis. She had passed its doors 100 times, always locked, always off-limits. Until now. An hour later, she made her way down the east corridor, her shoes nearly silent on the marble floors. The air grew colder, the windows darker. Most of the light came from antique wall sconces casting flickering glows along the hallway. At the far end, a door stood slightly ajar. She pushed it open. The room beyond was nothing like she expected. It was a bedroom, untouched by time. Dust covered the furniture, but everything remained exactly as it must have been left. A guitar leaned in one corner. Books were piled haphazardly on the desk. A photograph, framed in tarnished silver, showed two young men smiling with their arms around each other. One was unmistakably a younger Charles. The other, she recognized from old portraits in the hall, Louis. "Come in," Charles said from the far side of the room. He was standing beside a glass case that held several old letters and mementos. "This was my brother's room." Eleanor stepped inside slowly, her breath catching as she took in the space. "He died young," Charles said. "Too young. And he left behind mistakes." She said nothing, waiting. He reached into the glass case and pulled out a second letter, one that matched the torn one from the study. "I believe this belongs with the other half," he said quietly, handing it to her. Eleanor took it, her fingers shaking. "I don't know what you've been told," he went on, "but I think you deserve the truth. All of it." Eleanor unfolded the page, read the first line, and her knees almost gave out. The words were clear. "I should have never left Grace alone. Our daughter will one day ask who she is, and someone must be brave enough to tell her." Tears welled in her eyes as she looked up at him. "Why are you showing me this now?" "Because I watched you," Charles said. "I watched you resist everything I thought you'd take. I watched you find that letter, and I saw your face. I saw what it did to you. I needed to know what kind of person you were." He paused. "And now I know." Eleanor couldn't speak. Could barely breathe. "You are my niece," he said, the words heavy with both shame and something else, reverence, perhaps, or apology. "And this house owes you more than you know." The room fell into silence, save for the ticking of an old clock on the mantel. In that moment, something unspoken passed between them, not reconciliation, not forgiveness, but a crack in the wall that had always separated them. Neither of them knew what came next. But both knew that the past could no longer remain buried. The following days unfolded with an unfamiliar rhythm. Eleanor continued her duties as usual, but the air around her had changed, subtly at first, then unmistakably. Whispers quieted when she entered a room. Conversations stopped and started again in her wake. People watched her, not with curiosity, but with the sort of caution reserved for someone standing at the edge of something powerful and unknown. Charles did not summon her again. After the revelation in the East Wing, he withdrew into the pattern of silence that defined him. Yet the silence was not cold. It was contemplative, as if something inside him had begun to shift but hadn't yet taken shape. Eleanor, meanwhile, found herself revisiting the study in her thoughts, not for the open vault or the hidden cameras, but for the letter and what it had stirred. She hadn't yet told her mother. Every time she tried, the words stuck in her throat. She watched Grace from across the dinner table, saw the fatigue in her eyes, the strength in her spine, and realized her mother had lived with the weight of that secret for years, perhaps decades. And now it rested on Eleanor's shoulders too. One afternoon, she was assigned to polish the silverware in the main dining room, a tedious task that normally fell to one of the junior staff. She was surprised to be chosen, but didn't question it. She sat alone at the long oak table, her hands moving with mechanical focus, until she noticed something strange. One of the drawers in the sideboard was open just enough to reveal a corner of dark blue velvet. Inside was a wooden box. She glanced around. The room was empty. Carefully, she pulled it free and opened the lid. Inside was a delicate silver brooch, shaped like a lily in bloom, with a small sapphire in its center. Beneath it, a folded slip of paper read, "To Grace, for her strength." It wasn't signed, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Eleanor stared at the brooch for a long moment, then closed the box and returned it to its place. She didn't know how it had ended up there, or if it was meant to be found, but it told her one thing: Louis had cared. He hadn't simply vanished into death. He had left traces of intention, even if he hadn't lived to see them through. Later that day, as she exited through the side garden, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned, expecting another servant, but found herself face to face with Charles. He was dressed in his usual dark suit, but the stiffness was gone from his posture. His expression was unreadable, though his eyes looked heavier than usual. "I left something for your mother," he said. Eleanor hesitated. "The brooch?" He gave the faintest nod. "She should have received it long ago." "Why didn't she?" "Because I was angry," he replied, after a pause. "At my brother. At her. At everything I didn't understand." Eleanor watched him, uncertain of what to say. Then, cautiously, she asked, "Do you understand it now?" Charles looked past her, toward the orchard. His voice, when it came, was quieter than she'd ever heard it. "I think I'm beginning to." The next morning brought with it a new request, one that would have been unthinkable just days earlier. Eleanor was asked to assist Charles directly with sorting documents in the estate's personal archive. The news came from the butler, who offered no explanation, only the simple instruction: "He asked for you specifically." The archive was located in the lower level of the house, behind a concealed door in the corridor near the wine cellar. It was a narrow room lined with metal cabinets and wooden crates, filled with old estate ledgers, land records, correspondence, and artifacts spanning 3 generations of Beaumont wealth. Charles was already there when she arrived, sleeves rolled up, a pair of reading glasses perched on his nose. He looked out of place amid the dust and clutter. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I need someone with patience. Someone I can trust." It was the first time he had used that word in her presence. They spent the morning working side by side. He gave her small tasks at first, organizing boxes by year, labeling folders, sorting duplicates, but soon trusted her with more delicate items, personal letters, legal papers, files from the firm's early days. They didn't speak much. But the silence between them was different now. Not distant, simply unburdened by pretense. At one point, Eleanor came across a sealed envelope marked with a gold crest. She handed it to him, but he didn't take it. "Open it," he said. Inside was a letter addressed to Louis, dated the same year he died. It was from Charles. Eleanor read aloud. "I wish I could understand the choices you made. I wish I could hate you for what you left behind. But I can't. Not entirely. I still remember how you looked at her. I just hope you did right by the girl." She stopped, eyes lifting from the page. Charles didn't speak. His gaze was fixed on a distant memory, unreachable even to himself. They worked in silence for another hour. When it was time to leave, he said, "You'll return tomorrow?" "If you'd like me to." "I would." And she did. Day after day, she returned to the archive. And slowly, a fragile thread of trust began to form. Charles showed her old family photos, even laughed once, a dry, short sound, but real. He asked her about school. About books. About what she wanted for the future. No one else knew. No one else was told. Eleanor didn't speak of it to Grace, not yet. Her mother sensed the shift, but said nothing. Instead, she left a small wrapped parcel on Eleanor's bed one evening, a pressed handkerchief with the embroidered initials LM, and nothing more. By the end of the week, Charles did something no one expected. He gave Eleanor a key. Not to a room. To the library. "You're free to read anything you like," he said. "Consider it overdue access." She held the key in her palm as if it were a secret only she could understand. And maybe it was. That night, she entered the library alone. She walked through the towering shelves, running her fingers along the spines of volumes older than her entire existence. She didn't take anything at first. She simply walked, breathed in the knowledge, the permission, the strange intimacy of belonging in a space she had only ever dreamed of. At the far end, tucked between histories of Connecticut law and volumes on estate architecture, she found a small collection of classic fiction, worn, annotated, underlined in pencil. One book stood out, The Portrait of a Lady. Inside the front cover, a name was written. Louis M. Beaumont. And beneath it, in different handwriting, "She deserves to write her own ending." Eleanor sat in the leather armchair by the fire, the book in her lap, the house around her quieter than ever before. She did not know how the others would react. She did not know if this moment would last. But for the first time in her life, she felt the floor beneath her shift, not with fear, but with possibility. And far above, in his study, Charles looked out the window and whispered to the night. "She's not just her mother's daughter." The summer haze settled over the Beaumont estate like a curtain, muffling sound and thought in equal measure. The days grew longer, but the time inside the house seemed suspended, every hour thick with the presence of what remained unspoken. Eleanor felt it in every corridor she crossed, every glance from a maid who used to greet her with a smile but now simply nodded. Her relationship with Charles had not yet become public, but the signs were there, enough for the staff to sense the tremor beneath the surface. The key to the library remained in her pocket. She visited nightly, sometimes just to sit among the books and breathe in their quiet wisdom. She read by the lamp near the bay window, the scent of aging paper filling the stillness. It was there, one evening, while flipping through a weathered volume of estate records, that she noticed something tucked between the pages, a receipt dated 19 years prior, from a bookstore in New Haven. The purchase? A leather journal with gold trim. The handwriting on the receipt was familiar. It belonged to Louis. She stared at it, then slipped it between the pages of her own notebook. The discovery nagged at her. The receipt itself wasn't strange, except for the date. It matched the month Eleanor was born. The next morning, curiosity pulled her to the attic, a part of the house she had never dared enter before. She used the service stairwell, hoping to avoid questions. At the top of the narrow stairs, dust hung in the air like breath held too long. The attic was vast and cluttered, filled with forgotten trunks and furniture shrouded in white sheets. Sunlight leaked through small windows, casting the space in a pale glow. She began sifting through boxes labeled with names and years. There were old photo albums, childhood toys belonging to Charles's sons, stacks of magazines from decades past. But then, tucked beneath a crate of broken lamps, she found a small trunk with brass clasps. The initials on the lid stopped her heart. LMB. She opened it slowly. Inside, wrapped in a linen cloth, was a leather-bound journal. Gold trim, just like the receipt had described. She opened to the first page. To the child I've never met, and the woman I will always love. Her breath hitched. The journal wasn't filled with business notes or travel logs. It was a diary. Louis's diary. Page after page of personal thoughts, entries written in longhand, raw and unedited. He had written almost daily in the months leading up to Eleanor's birth. She sat on the attic floor, surrounded by the scent of cedar and thyme, and read for hours. In the entries, Louis confessed his fears and regrets, about not being strong enough to defy his brother, about the shame he felt for hiding Grace from the world. He described her in detail, the way she laughed when no one was watching, how she never asked for anything yet gave so much. And he wrote about Eleanor, not by name, but as the child. He mentioned her kicks, her expected birth date, and once, near the end, he wrote, "I have already failed her, and she is not even born." One entry stood apart, dated just 3 weeks before his death. "I've drafted the letter. It's not enough, but it's something. If Charles finds it first, I pray he has the decency to finish what I never could. And if the girl finds it, maybe, somehow, she will know who I was." Eleanor's hands trembled. The entry confirmed what she now believed without doubt: her father had intended for her to know the truth. He had feared the consequences, yes, Charles's anger, society's judgment, but the desire to be known, to be seen by the daughter he never held, had driven him to document everything he dared not say aloud. She closed the journal, pressing it against her chest. That night, when Grace returned from work, Eleanor sat her down in the kitchen and placed the diary between them. "I found this," she said softly. "In the attic." Grace didn't touch it. Her eyes filled instantly, but she did not cry. Instead, she reached out and folded Eleanor's hand into hers. "I always hoped you'd find him," she whispered. "I think I have." They spent the evening reading the journal together, page by page, stopping only when the words became too heavy to speak. Grace revealed fragments of her own, how Louis had promised to leave with her but backed out at the last moment, how Charles had intervened, furious and ashamed, ordering her to keep the child away from the public eye. She admitted she had stayed not out of loyalty, but because she had nowhere else to go. And because, in some cruel way, Charles had protected her, not kindly, but effectively. "He made sure you had a roof, education, safety. But he kept your name buried. He couldn't face what his brother had done, so he controlled it instead." Eleanor listened, absorbing every syllable like water into dry earth. The next day, she returned to the archive, the diary hidden in her satchel. Charles was already there, sorting through boxes of old business filings. He looked up when she entered but didn't speak until she set the diary on the table between them. "I found it," she said. He stared at the journal for a long time before lifting the cover. "I remember this," he murmured. "He never let anyone see it. I thought it was just notes. It's more than that." He flipped through a few pages, then stopped. "You've read it? All of it?" Charles let out a slow breath. "Then you know." "I know he wanted to tell the truth. And I know you stopped him." He didn't deny it. Instead, he closed the journal gently and looked her in the eye. "I didn't stop him to be cruel. I stopped him because I didn't believe Grace was right for him. I thought she was after our name, our money. I was wrong. I see that now. Too late. Yes, he admitted. Far too late. There was a long silence, but Eleanor didn't leave. She stayed, not because she forgave him, not yet, but because part of her wanted to understand the man who had shaped her life from behind a curtain of control. Charles picked up the diary again, and this time, he opened to the back cover. Taped inside was a folded piece of paper. He removed it, unfolded it, and read aloud. In the event of my death, I leave behind my personal effects to Grace M., and the child she carries, should she choose to accept them. May they live freely, if not fully acknowledged. It was signed. Dated. Witnessed by a notary. Charles looked up. This was never filed. Why not? Because he didn't give it to me. He must have hidden it. And you could still file it now, Eleanor said quietly. Couldn't you? He didn't answer immediately. But the look in his eyes shifted. Not cold. Not defensive. Just, human. I could. Eleanor nodded, then turned to leave. At the door, she paused. You said once that everyone has a price, she said. But I don't want anything. Not money. Not a title. Just the truth. And for her to be respected for what she survived. Charles didn't speak as she left, but his silence, for once, was not the silence of dismissal. It was the silence of reckoning. That evening, Charles opened a bottle of wine he had been saving for over 2 decades. He sat in his study, surrounded by the ticking of clocks and the glow of old lamps, and read every page of his brother's journal. He did not cry. But when he reached the final entry, the one about the letter and the unfinished apology, he whispered to the room, I see her now, Louis. I see both of them. In the morning, the estate lawyer received an unexpected call. There was an old document that needed to be filed. And a name that finally needed to be recognized. The morning after Charles's call to the estate lawyer, the atmosphere in the Beaumont house took on a peculiar edge. The staff moved with unusual stiffness, the butler's voice clipped, and the cook, usually humming while preparing breakfast, worked in silence. Something had shifted, not openly discussed, but undeniably felt. Grace noticed it first. When she entered the pantry to collect the inventory ledger, she found it missing. Instead, a junior maid handed it to her with a brief apology and eyes that didn't meet hers. Later, as she walked down the central corridor, 2 groundskeepers paused their conversation when she approached and offered forced, polite nods. Grace had lived under judgment before, but never like this, never with the feeling that something known only in whispers had surfaced and spread like smoke under a locked door. She knew it had to be Charles. He had revealed something. Not fully. Not yet. But enough for the house to begin reorienting around it. In the late afternoon, as sunlight bathed the orchard in gold, Charles requested her presence in the east parlor, another room rarely used since Louis's death. Grace arrived with her shoulders squared, her face calm, though her heart beat like a warning bell. Charles was seated near the tall window, a glass of water untouched at his side. He stood when she entered. Grace, he said, his voice quieter than she expected, thank you for coming. I didn't have much choice, she replied. He offered a faint smile, then gestured for her to sit. She remained standing. I filed the document Louis left, he said without preamble. The acknowledgement of paternity. It's legally binding now. Grace blinked once. You're serious? Yes. She looked away, toward the orchard, letting the silence stretch. And why now? She asked. After 17 years? After forcing her to grow up invisible? Charles exhaled, the weight of decades pressing into his ribs. Because I was wrong. About you. About her. About what I thought I was protecting. You weren't protecting anything. You were punishing us for what your brother loved. Charles didn't argue. He simply nodded. I'm not asking for forgiveness, he said. But I am trying to make this right. Or at least, less wrong. Grace finally moved to the edge of the chair, perching lightly as if unsure whether to stay. She folded her hands in her lap, her knuckles white. "What does this change?" "For now, nothing visible," he replied. "The name won't be announced. No press, no formal ceremony. But she's listed. She has legal rights." Grace's eyes flicked to his. "And the family?" "They don't know yet. But they will." There was a pause before she asked, "And Eleanor?" "She knows," he said. "She read the journal." At this, Grace's gaze softened just slightly. "She's stronger than either of us expected." Charles nodded. "She reminds me of him. Not in appearance, but in spirit. She refuses to be what anyone expects." The room settled into silence again, but it was no longer hostile. It was filled with something that had never been permitted before, mutual grief. Grace stood, smoothing her skirt. "She's never needed your name," she said. "But maybe now she'll believe she deserves it." As she turned to go, Charles added, "She deserves more than that. And I intend to give her what I can, if she'll accept it." That night, Eleanor sat under the tree near the back of the orchard, her journal open across her knees. She had come to this spot since she was a child, often alone, sometimes reading, sometimes simply staring at the sky. But tonight, her peace was broken by the unexpected sound of footsteps on gravel. She looked up to see Charles approaching. He stopped a few feet away, unsure whether to join her or not. "May I?" he asked. She nodded, surprised. He sat stiffly on the bench opposite hers, gazing out over the lawn. "I spoke to your mother today." Eleanor waited. "She's still stronger than I am," he said with a dry smile. "Always was. She had to be." He nodded. "You both did." They sat in silence for a moment, and then Charles pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. He held it out to her. "This is the official copy of what I filed. You'll receive a formal notification in the coming weeks, but I wanted you to see it first." She took the paper and unfolded it slowly. It was real. It bore the family crest, the legal stamp, and the words, "Acknowledgement of paternity, Louis Martin Beaumont, father of Eleanor Grace Myers." She read it twice, barely breathing. "Thank you," she said finally. Charles looked at her, the lines around his eyes deepening. "You don't owe me anything. I should have done this years ago. Before the cameras. Before the tests. Then why did you?" He paused, and when he answered, it was not with arrogance or guilt, but with something quieter. "Because watching you made me realize how much of him I had tried to erase. And how wrong that was." Eleanor folded the paper and placed it inside her journal. "I don't want anything else," she said. "No money. No inheritance. You already said that. But I want people to know she didn't raise me alone because she had to. She did it because you let her." Charles flinched, just slightly. "I deserve that." Eleanor stood. "I don't want revenge," she added. "But I want the truth to live in this house. Even if it's just in whispers. Even if it takes time." He nodded slowly. "It will." Before she left, he said, "You remind me of someone. Someone I once admired, before I grew afraid of what he stood for." Eleanor looked back over her shoulder. "You mean your brother?" Charles shook his head. "No. I mean you." The next morning, a formal letter arrived for Grace, sealed with the estate crest. It was an invitation, private, discreet, to attend a dinner in the main house as a guest. Not as staff. No one had received such a gesture in all the years she had worked there. When she showed the letter to Eleanor, they said nothing for a long time. Just looked at each other, the quiet weight of what it meant settling between them. Neither of them smiled. But neither of them said no. The invitation changed everything, even if nothing was spoken aloud. Grace had never stepped into the Beaumont dining room as anything other than a worker, never sat at the long mahogany table as an equal, never used the fine china except to polish it for others. Yet now, a single envelope had altered the unspoken laws of the house. And everyone noticed. The dinner was set for Thursday evening, a quiet affair with no guests besides Charles, Grace, and Eleanor. No press. No extended family. No announcements. Just 3 people linked by blood, silence, and 17 years of fragmented truth. As the day approached, Eleanor felt the weight of uncertainty settle around her. Not fear, she was past that now, but the kind of unease that came with watching something long hidden begin to surface, without knowing what form it would take. She could tell her mother was wrestling with it too. Grace spent hours deciding what to wear, not out of vanity but because the act itself felt absurd, choosing a dress for a dinner in the same room where she had once been scolded for not folding napkins correctly. When Thursday arrived, the mansion seemed oddly hushed. The staff, though not officially informed, understood enough to move differently. No one questioned why the head housekeeper didn't report for duty that day. No one asked why Eleanor was seen carrying a garment bag from the cottage to the main house. Some averted their eyes. Others watched openly, curiosity barely disguised. That evening, Eleanor walked beside her mother across the lawn from their small cottage to the mansion, both of them dressed simply but with care. As they approached the front entrance, a path usually reserved for guests and owners, Grace hesitated. Eleanor paused. "We don't have to do this." Grace looked at the massive double doors, her jaw set. "No. We do." They entered through the front, where the butler, the same man who had assigned Grace duties for over a decade, opened the door without a word. His face was unreadable, but he inclined his head ever so slightly as they passed. The dining room was already lit. Candles flickered against crystal and glass. Charles stood by the sideboard, no tie, sleeves slightly rolled. He turned as they entered, and for a moment, said nothing. Just looked at Grace, really looked, as if seeing her for the first time outside the confines of rank and routine. "Thank you for coming," he said. Grace gave a faint nod. "You asked." He gestured to the table. "Please." They sat, awkward at first. The silence was not hostile, but it was full, crowded with everything they didn't know how to say. The meal was simple, deliberately unceremonious. Roast chicken, fresh vegetables, wine. They ate slowly, speaking only in brief exchanges about the food, the weather, Eleanor's studies. Then Charles set down his fork and leaned back. "I don't intend to pretend this is normal," he said. "Because it's not. I've done things I can't undo. But I'd like to explain some of it." Grace didn't interrupt. She let him speak. "I was angry when Louis died. Not just because of how he lived, but because he left chaos behind. I was left to manage the house, the company, the rumors. And then, when I found out about you, and the child, I made a decision. A cruel one, maybe, but one I thought was necessary." Eleanor watched her mother closely. Grace's face was still, but her hands were tight in her lap. "You thought keeping her in silence would protect the family," Grace said. "Yes. And maybe I thought I was punishing you both for what he couldn't face. I didn't think it was fair that he got to be reckless, and I had to clean up after him." "You think this was reckless?" Eleanor asked suddenly. "Loving someone you weren't supposed to? That's what this was about?" Charles looked at her. "At the time, yes. It felt like a betrayal. Of the family. Of me. But it wasn't your life," she said. "It was his. And mine. And hers." Charles nodded slowly. "I see that now." There was a long pause before Grace spoke again. "So why the dinner? Why now?" "Because the silence is killing more than the truth ever could. And because I owe you both more than a name on a legal form." He reached into his coat and pulled out another envelope. "This is the deed to one of the guest houses on the far edge of the estate. It's been vacant for years. I've had it renovated. If you want it, either of you, it's yours." Grace looked stunned. "You're giving us property?" "I'm giving you space." privacy, stability, and a choice. Eleanor took the envelope and placed it gently on the table. Why not just ask us what we want? Because I assumed you didn't want anything from me, he said. Maybe we don't, Eleanor replied. But you should still ask. Charles nodded, chastened. They finished dinner with no further surprises. When the plates were cleared, and the wine nearly gone, Grace looked up. I'm not moving into that house, she said. Not yet. Not until I believe this isn't a performance. Charles didn't flinch. I understand. But I'll think about it, she added. And that's more than I ever planned to give you. He gave a faint smile. Then I'll take it. As they stood to leave, Charles opened a side cabinet and removed a box. Inside were several photographs, most of them old, some newer, all of Louis. One showed him as a child, another with Grace, laughing beneath the orchard trees. There was even one Eleanor had never seen, her mother holding a newborn, her face turned away from the camera. These were his, Charles said. They belong with you. Eleanor took the box. Outside, as she and her mother walked back through the garden, Grace was quiet. Eleanor asked, was that as strange for you as it was for me? Stranger, Grace replied. I didn't expect him to offer anything real. Do you believe him? Grace didn't answer right away. Then she said, he's trying. But I don't know if it's for us or for him. And does it matter? It might. They walked on in silence. The stars were out, and the house behind them glowed like a relic from a different life. Back in the cottage, Eleanor placed the box of photographs on the kitchen table and opened the lid. She took out the image of her mother and the newborn and studied it in silence. No longer wondering who she was, but questioning, for the first time, who she might become. Within days of the dinner, a subtle current of suspicion began to swell within the estate. It started in whispers between servants and tightened in glances exchanged in hallways. The staff, bound together by years of rigid routine, sensed an imbalance that no official memo had announced but that everyone understood instinctively. The boundaries between upstairs and downstairs had shifted. And Eleanor, once invisible, now walked corridors that had long been off-limits, not with arrogance, but with permission. It was during one of her visits to the library, a quiet afternoon marked by sunbeams streaking through stained glass, that the tension finally broke into words. She was seated in the far corner, flipping through a biography on historical estates, when she heard footsteps and a throat being cleared behind her. She turned. It was Celeste, one of the senior housemaids. A woman who had worked in the estate for nearly 20 years, known for her precision and silence. I didn't realize the library was open to everyone now, Celeste said, her tone clipped but not loud. Eleanor closed the book slowly. Mr. Beaumont gave me permission. I'm sure he did. Celeste's eyes didn't blink. Still strange, though, don't you think? After all this time. What's strange? Eleanor asked, keeping her voice even. The way things change. Who's given access? Who's invited to dinner? Eleanor stood. If you have something to say, Celeste, say it. The woman's lips tightened. You think we haven't noticed? You, walking around like you own the place. We all saw that dress you wore to the dinner. Silk. Not from any shop around here. And we heard about the guest house. Nothing has changed about who I am, Eleanor replied. I haven't asked for any of this. Celeste laughed once, dryly. No need to ask. He's offering it freely now, isn't he? Must be nice, being born lucky after all. Eleanor held her ground, though her hands trembled behind her back. I earned his respect. Not his pity. Well, that's not what people are saying, Celeste snapped. They're saying you've manipulated him. Gotten into his head. Maybe even into his will. The words hit like a slap. Eleanor blinked, stunned. Celeste didn't wait for a response. She turned on her heel and left, her footsteps hard against the floorboards. Eleanor stood there for a long moment, then slowly lowered herself back into the chair. But she didn't reopen the book. Her mind was racing too fast. By the end of the day, the ripples of that encounter had spread. A pair of gardeners stopped speaking when she passed. 2 kitchen assistants, whom she'd laughed with just a week earlier, offered only short nods and avoided her gaze. Even the butler, always cordial if not warm, now delivered her messages with a touch of distance, his words stiff with unasked questions. At dinner, Eleanor told Grace everything. Her mother listened quietly, folding napkins at the kitchen table as her daughter spoke. When Eleanor finished, Grace set the napkins down and looked her in the eyes. "I expected this," she said. "I thought they respected you." "They did," Grace replied. "They still do. But respect is fragile when it gets tangled with resentment. I was one of them, Eleanor. Now I'm not. And neither are you. What should I do? Decide what matters more, being liked or being right." Eleanor leaned back in her chair, overwhelmed. "I didn't ask for any of this." "You're right," Grace said. "But that doesn't mean it hasn't come. And you don't get to step into a legacy like this without stepping on someone else's pride. They think you jumped the line. There was never a line." "No," Grace said gently. "But they believe there was." That night, Eleanor avoided the main house. Instead, she walked the edge of the orchard, trying to make sense of the storm building around her. For so long, she had dreamed of simply being acknowledged, of no longer having to pretend she didn't see the injustice of her position. But now that she had stepped into the light, it seemed everyone else was determined to shove her back into the shadows. 2 days later, Charles called her into the study. He was seated behind his desk, papers spread before him, his expression unreadable. "I received a complaint," he said. Eleanor nodded, unsurprised. "Celeste?" "Among others." "What did she say?" "That you've been disruptive. Distracting. That your presence is damaging morale." Eleanor's jaw clenched. "And do you believe that?" Charles studied her carefully. "I believe people resist change. Especially when it forces them to confront their assumptions." "And what will you do?" "I already did it," he replied. "I asked her if she would be willing to take a leave of absence. She declined." Eleanor blinked. "You offered her time off because she insulted me?" "I offered her time to reflect. She declined. So I terminated her employment." The words fell like a stone between them. "You fired her?" "Yes." "Charles," she stopped, then tried again. "That's only going to make things worse. Now they'll say I'm getting rid of anyone who speaks out." "They can say what they like," he replied. "What matters is the truth." "No," she said firmly. "What matters is that they feel heard. And right now, they don't." Charles leaned back. "You want me to bring her back?" "I want you to understand that this isn't about her. Or about me. It's about everyone else watching what happens next." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "You should not have to defend yourself for being born." "But I do," she said. "And if I don't do it the right way, I'll lose them. And so will you." He sighed and rubbed his temple. "What do you suggest?" "Bring her back. Not because she was right, but because we need to show we can handle this with grace. Not punishment." He tilted his head. "Grace?" Eleanor smiled faintly. "No pun intended." He let out a short laugh, then nodded. "Very well. I'll speak to her." That evening, Eleanor took a bold step of her own. She gathered the junior staff, the maids, the kitchen team, the laundry workers, and met with them in the garden courtyard after hours. Grace stood quietly in the background, watching but letting her daughter lead. Eleanor addressed them honestly, without prepared speeches or apologies. "I know things have changed," she said. "And I know you're angry. Some of you feel betrayed. Some of you think I've taken something that wasn't mine. But the truth is, I didn't ask for any of this. I only ever wanted to be seen. Just like all of you. No one spoke, but no one left either. She continued. I'm not here to take over. I'm not replacing anyone. But I can't pretend nothing's different. What I can do is promise you that I won't forget where I came from. That I'll still walk through that back gate if I have to. And that I'll never close a door behind me that someone else might need open. It wasn't a rally. It wasn't even a reconciliation. But it was enough. Some nodded. A few clapped softly. Celeste, who had been reinstated earlier that day, said nothing, but she lingered longer than anyone else, her arms crossed, her face unreadable. When the group dispersed, Grace came to her daughter's side. You did good, she said. I don't know, Eleanor replied. But I tried. And for now, that was enough. In the weeks that followed, the estate settled into a fragile new rhythm. The unrest among the staff had quieted, not vanquished, but soothed by Eleanor's gesture and Charles's surprising restraint. Grace continued her duties as before, though she now walked with a new posture, not proud, but anchored. Her decades of silence had not been erased, but they had finally been acknowledged. Charles, however, had grown distant again. He no longer called for Eleanor daily. Their talks in the library and archive became infrequent, and he spent most of his time in his private study. The shift wasn't cold, only reflective, as if the wave of recent change had stirred something buried even deeper in him. And Eleanor, despite everything, felt it. Not abandonment, but anticipation. Something was coming. It began with a storm. One morning, a heavy downpour rolled in from the coast, drenching the grounds and turning the orchard paths into rivers of mud. Grace had taken shelter in the laundry room, and Eleanor wandered the lower levels of the house, restless. She made her way to the western wing, the oldest part of the mansion, and found herself standing before a heavy wooden door she had only passed a few times before, the family archive room, locked for years after Louis's death. She hesitated, then knocked. No answer. She tried the handle. It turned. Inside, the room smelled of cedar and dust. Shelves lined the walls, filled with ledgers, scrapbooks, and preserved family documents. The only light came from a small stained glass window near the ceiling. At the center stood a desk, not Charles's, smaller, with curved legs and brass details. A notebook lay open on its surface, and beside it, a box sealed with wax. Eleanor approached the shelves first. She skimmed titles and labels until her fingers paused over a row of old journals bound in leather. They were dated in gold leaf, 1983, 1984, 1985. She pulled the one labeled 1986. Inside were diary entries, not from Charles, but from Louis. Younger, more impulsive. His voice leapt off the pages with wit and melancholy. He wrote about his travels, his ideas for a book he never published, his frustrations with the rigid family expectations. And as the months passed, the entries shifted, from casual, almost flippant, to something deeper. June 5th, she's unlike anyone I've met. She doesn't try to impress. Doesn't ask for anything. I find myself inventing errands just to pass through the laundry hall. July 12th, if Charles knew, he'd call it a scandal. But I think she's the only real person in this entire house. Eleanor sat down slowly, the journal trembling in her hands. August 19th, she's pregnant. And I'm terrified. But also, something else. Something closer to peace than I've ever known. I want to be there. I want to try. But I know how this family eats people alive. I don't know if I can protect her. She turned the page. The next entry came weeks later, the handwriting different, more frantic. September 4th, Charles found out. I don't know how. He cornered me. Called me reckless, naive. Said I was throwing everything away. I told him I didn't care. But I think part of me still wanted his approval. God help me. The final entry in that volume was dated September 23rd. I've written to Grace. I told her I'm preparing something legal. If anything happens, I want it documented. I want our daughter, yes, I said it, our daughter to know I was trying. I've asked the notary to meet me next week." Eleanor closed the journal, hands shaking. So much of what had been hinted at now unfolded in his own words. Louis had not been absent. He had been trapped, by fear, by family, and eventually, by death. She turned to the box on the desk. The wax seal bore the Beaumont crest. Inside, she found dozens of letters bundled with ribbon. Most were addressed to Charles. Some were drafts, some duplicates. But at the bottom of the box, folded separately, was a single yellowed envelope addressed to the rightful heir of the orchard and its ghosts. She opened it. The handwriting was unmistakably Louis's. "To the one who bears my name in silence. I leave this house not as inheritance, but as witness. I failed to stand when I should have, and now others carry the weight of my cowardice. But know this, you were always real to me. Always mine. If this house has any soul left, it lives in you." No signature. No date. Just a smudge where the ink had blurred, as if he had hesitated before writing more. Eleanor sat in silence for a long time. The rain tapped against the window, steady and soft. Her thoughts spun in loops, through her father's fear, her uncle's control, her mother's strength, and her own quiet rage at being made a secret. When she returned to the study later that evening, she found Charles seated at the desk, a stack of old photographs in front of him. He looked up as she entered. "You went into the archive," he said. Not a question. "Yes." He didn't seem angry. Only tired. "You were always going to find it eventually," he murmured. "Part of me hoped you would." "Why didn't you destroy them?" she asked. He hesitated. "Because I knew they were true." Eleanor stepped closer. "He tried, Charles. He tried to tell you." "I know." "Then why didn't you listen?" Charles stared down at the photographs. "Because I was afraid of losing control. I thought if I let him live that life, with her, with you, it would mean I had no say anymore. That the family legacy would unravel." She didn't respond. "I was wrong," he added. "But by the time I admitted that, it was too late." Eleanor reached into her bag and pulled out the envelope Louis had written to her. She handed it to Charles. He read it in silence. When he finished, he set it down slowly. "He had more heart than I ever gave him credit for. And now I'm the one who has to carry that heart," Eleanor said. "Whether I want to or not." Charles looked at her with something close to awe. "You've done more than carry it. You've honored it." There was a long pause. Then he said, "There's one more thing. Something I didn't know until yesterday." He opened a drawer and removed a thick legal binder. Inside was a copy of the original Beaumont Trust, the document outlining the conditions of inheritance for all direct descendants. "There's a clause," Charles said, turning the pages. "It was written by my grandfather. It allows for a silent heir to be included in the family trust if paternity can be proven, even retroactively." Eleanor's breath caught. He found the page and pointed. "If you choose, you can claim it. Not just the name. Not just a cottage or a key. But an actual stake in this estate. In the company. In everything." Eleanor stared at the words. "And what happens if I don't?" "Then it stays with me. And eventually, to the distant cousins I can barely tolerate. But I don't want that. I don't want their resentment. They resent you already. What you do next won't change that." She looked up. "And what do you want from me in return?" "Nothing," Charles said. "Only that you keep walking through this house like you belong. Because you do." She nodded slowly, then closed the binder. "I'll think about it." As she turned to leave, Charles said, "You may not realize it yet, but this place, this legacy, needs you more than you need it." She paused at the door. "Maybe," she said. "But I need to know who I am before I decide what I'm meant to lead." Then she left him in silence, holding the letter of a brother he had failed, and the echo of a daughter he would never dare to doubt again. It was late October when Charles Beaumont formally requested a private meeting with Grace and Eleanor. The tone of his invitation was solemn but clear, no vague implications, no polite suggestions. This time, it was not about dinners or property offers or soft attempts at redemption. It was about finality. The letter arrived in the morning, delivered by the butler in an envelope sealed with the Beaumont crest. Grace read it first, then silently passed it to her daughter, her eyes betraying a storm she did not voice. The letter asked for their presence in the study that evening at 7 o'clock sharp. No agenda was listed. No words of comfort were included. "He's decided something," Grace said quietly. Eleanor nodded. "So have we." The hours until the meeting passed like a heavy wind pressing against closed windows. Eleanor went for a long walk through the orchard, her boots crunching over fallen leaves, while Grace remained in the cottage, pacing in slow, quiet circles. Neither of them spoke much when Eleanor returned. They just prepared, in silence, for whatever version of truth Charles was finally ready to put into words. At precisely 7, they entered the main house together. A fire burned low in the study, casting long shadows over the heavy wooden walls. The room smelled faintly of old books and leather, as it always had. But tonight, it also held a new scent, resolution. Charles stood behind his desk, hands clasped, posture rigid. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes looked more tired than Eleanor had ever seen them. As they entered, he gestured for them to sit. They did, not as guests, not as employees, but as two people who had waited long enough. "I appreciate you coming," he began. "I won't speak in riddles tonight. I've spent the past month reviewing everything, the legal documents, the journals, the trust conditions, even our family's public standing. And I've come to a conclusion." Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her face calm. Grace remained upright, arms crossed lightly, unreadable. "I am making it official," he continued. "Louis's paternity of Eleanor will be publicly acknowledged. The documents are ready. They will be filed with the family firm and the estate trust within the week." He paused, giving them time to absorb it. "I will also be adding Eleanor's name to the formal Beaumont lineage registry. Her legal last name will not change unless she chooses it. But her place in the family will be documented. Irrevocably." Eleanor let the silence stretch before asking, "And the inheritance?" Charles didn't blink. "She will receive the percentage allocated to any direct descendant of Louis. This includes a stake in the firm, a claim on the estate, and access to the family's investment portfolio." Grace's fingers tightened against her armrest, but she said nothing. "There will be backlash," he added. "From the board. From the extended family. But I'm prepared to face it. I should have done it 17 years ago. I'm doing it now." Eleanor studied him. "Why are you telling us this way?" "Because I didn't want this to be a gesture," he said. "Or a performance. I wanted it to be formal. Documented. Binding. No more hidden conversations. No more backroom apologies." He opened a folder and slid a stack of papers across the desk. "These are your copies. The filings. The amendment to the trust. The inclusion in the corporate register." Grace reached for them, her hands steadier than her eyes. "I also want to discuss something else," Charles said. "Eleanor, I'd like you to consider joining the board as a non-voting member for now. You'll observe. Learn. And eventually, if you choose, vote." Eleanor's heart skipped once, not out of excitement, but from the gravity of it. "I haven't finished school." "You'll continue," he said. "But you're already sharper than half the partners on that board. You have a right to be there. And I want you to be prepared." Grace finally spoke. "You're bringing her into the family business." "I'm inviting her," Charles corrected. "Not forcing her." He turned to Eleanor. "I don't expect gratitude. But I do want to know, is this something you want?" She was silent for a moment. Then, slowly, she said, I want to know what I'm capable of. If that means learning how this world works, then yes. I'll accept. Charles nodded once. Grace, still holding the documents, exhaled. What about them? She asked. Your cousins. The shareholders. The Beaumont board? They'll protest. But they'll adapt, he replied. And if they don't, they'll be replaced. The cold efficiency of the statement wasn't cruel. It was simply the language of the empire Charles had built. And what happens now? Eleanor asked. You decide your future, he said. With the truth behind you. Not secrecy. He stood, walked around the desk, and paused beside Grace. I've wronged you more deeply than most men could imagine. I can't fix that. But I can stop letting my guilt dictate my silence. Grace looked up at him, then slowly stood as well. You can't erase 17 years, she said. No, he replied. But I can honor them. They stood in that strange, brittle peace, not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but the closest thing to truth any of them had shared. As Grace and Eleanor prepared to leave, Charles added one final thing. There's something in the vault I want you to have, he said, turning to Eleanor. Your father's watch. He left it here the last night he was alive. I didn't know what to do with it. He walked to the safe behind the oil painting and, with careful fingers, unlocked it. From inside, he retrieved a small, weathered box. Eleanor accepted it silently. Inside was a pocket watch, gold, engraved with the initials LMB, and a tiny inscription inside the lid. To time well spent. Her throat tightened. She closed the box and looked up at Charles. Thank you, she said. Not for the object. But for the memory he had finally released from hiding. They left the study without ceremony, walking side by side through the long corridor, past the portraits of ancestors who had never known their names, past rooms once closed to them, and toward a future that, while uncertain, would never again be denied. The announcement did not come with press releases or public fanfare, but in the tight-knit circles of Connecticut high society, news traveled with a speed that rivaled any newspaper. Within a week of Charles filing the documents, the extended Beaumont family knew. The name Eleanor Grace Myers was now officially tied to the Beaumont lineage and, more importantly, to the family's financial trust. That, more than the revelation of her bloodline, lit the first sparks of outrage. It began with a letter. Delivered by courier to the estate, it was addressed directly to Charles in the flowing script of his cousin, Meredith Beaumont Harding. The message was polite in tone but sharp in content, an objection to the unprecedented inclusion of an unvetted descendant into the trust, citing potential instability and erosion of family dignity. The letter never mentioned Eleanor by name, but every word dripped with the implication that she was unworthy. Charles read it twice, then set it down on his desk and summoned Eleanor to his study. When she arrived, he slid the letter across the polished wood without a word. She read it in silence, her jaw tightening with each line. She could have just said she doesn't want me here, Eleanor said finally. She won't say it outright, Charles replied. They never do. They prefer to dress their insults in etiquette. Will there be more like this? He nodded. Dozens. And not just letters. There will be calls to the board, whispers in social clubs, even attempts to persuade my attorneys to contest the filing. Eleanor placed the letter back on his desk. Then let them. His lips curved faintly, not in amusement, but in acknowledgement of her resolve. The first real confrontation came 3 days later. Charles had called a private family meeting at the estate, inviting only those directly connected to the trust. Grace refused to attend, telling Eleanor, I've sat through enough of their thinly veiled insults. This is your name now, you fight for it if you choose. And Eleanor did choose. The meeting was held in the blue drawing room, a place more often used for art receptions than family disputes. When she entered with Charles, the room fell into a tense silence. Meredith sat near the fireplace, her pearl necklace gleaming against a navy dress, her posture rigid. Beside her were 2 other cousins, Edward and Simon, both older men with the same sharp Beaumont cheekbones but none of Charles's quiet authority. Charles opened the meeting without ceremony. "You all know why we're here. Eleanor is my late brother Louis's daughter. She is now legally recognized in the family registry and in the trust. That is not up for debate." "Everything is up for debate," Meredith countered smoothly. "Especially when it concerns the preservation of our family's assets." "It's not your place to decide who is or isn't part of this family," Charles said. "It is my place," Edward interjected, "to question the sudden appearance of a new heir after nearly 2 decades of silence. The optics are questionable." Eleanor, standing beside Charles, spoke for the first time. "The only questionable thing here is why it took 17 years for the truth to be acknowledged." Simon leaned forward, his voice dripping with condescension. "My dear, the truth and public perception are not the same. Our family's name carries weight. It must be protected." "I'm not here to damage your name," Eleanor said evenly. "But I won't hide to protect it either." The exchange went on for over an hour. They questioned her upbringing, her education, even her understanding of the company's operations. Charles deflected some of their sharper remarks, but there were moments when he let Eleanor speak entirely for herself. She did so without flinching, answering their challenges with a clarity that surprised even him. By the end, the cousins had made it clear they would not welcome her warmly. But they also understood something else, that she would not be pushed out. And Charles's presence at her side made that fact unshakable. After the meeting, as they walked down the hallway lined with portraits of Beaumont ancestors, Eleanor exhaled deeply. "That's what you deal with all the time?" she asked. Charles smirked faintly. "Worse, sometimes. I can see why my father left the family part out of his life." Charles glanced at her. He didn't leave it out. He just didn't get the chance to live it on his terms. The weeks that followed brought more resistance. Meredith began a quiet campaign among the board to limit Eleanor's influence before it even began. Edward reached out to mutual contacts in the legal world to explore potential loopholes in the trust amendment. But every attempt found the same obstacle: Charles himself. His authority within the family and the firm was too deeply entrenched for any immediate challenge to succeed. And yet, the tension didn't subside, it grew heavier, settling over the estate like a low fog. One evening, Eleanor found herself alone in the library, reviewing a thick binder of company history Charles had given her. The numbers, the strategies, the decades of expansion, they fascinated her. But what struck her most was how often the firm's success had been built on taking risks no one else would. It wasn't the careful, image-protecting machine her relatives claimed it to be. It had been bold once. Visionary. Her father's name appeared in several early proposals, proof that he, too, had shaped part of this legacy. Charles entered quietly, watching her read. "You're taking this seriously," he observed. "If I'm going to be accused of being here for the money," she replied, "I'd rather be overprepared." He nodded. "Good. They'll keep testing you. Every time you speak, every decision you make, they'll be looking for weakness." "They won't find it," she said. For the first time in weeks, he smiled fully. "That's what your father would have said." The next day, Charles arranged for Eleanor to meet with the firm's legal counsel and financial advisors, not as a token guest, but as someone who would be making decisions in the future. It was his way of solidifying her position, not just within the family, but in the machinery of the empire itself. Some in the room treated her with skepticism, but others, particularly the younger executives, saw in her a reflection of the firm's early daring. She asked sharp questions. She challenged vague answers. And she took notes with the precision of someone who intended to act on them. When the meeting ended, the head of legal, a woman named Caroline, pulled her aside. "You'll make enemies faster than you make friends," she warned. "But if you keep this up, you'll outlast them." That night, Eleanor returned to the cottage, the legal papers from Charles's desk still in her bag. Grace was waiting at the table, a kettle steaming between them. "How was it?" Grace asked. "Hostile," Eleanor admitted. "But I think I can handle it." Grace studied her for a long moment. Your father would be proud. Not because you're in their world, but because you're not letting them push you out of it." Eleanor didn't respond right away. She just poured the tea, the sound of it filling the quiet kitchen. The storm inside the family wasn't over. But for the first time, Eleanor felt not just acknowledged, but ready to fight for the place she'd been denied for so long. November came with cold winds and bare trees, the orchard stripped of its leaves and the estate feeling heavier under gray skies. Yet inside the mansion, Eleanor felt a shift that had nothing to do with the weather. The legal battles, the family objections, the tense meetings, they hadn't disappeared, but they no longer consumed her every step. Charles had begun introducing her to a different side of the Beaumont legacy, one she hadn't expected: the day-to-day running of the firm, the negotiations, and the people who worked there not because of the family name, but because they were the best at what they did. 3 mornings a week, she accompanied Charles into the city, sitting in on department briefings at the firm's headquarters. At first she stayed quiet, taking notes and trying to absorb the language of finance, but it didn't take long for her to start asking questions. In one meeting about an upcoming property acquisition, she raised a concern no one else had mentioned: the environmental impact of the development plan. Several executives exchanged glances, as though the subject were a nuisance rather than a legitimate point. Charles didn't shut her down. Instead, he asked the head of development to prepare a report by the following week, just to address her concerns. On the ride back to the estate that day, Charles broke the silence. "You were right to bring it up," he said. Eleanor glanced at him. "I thought you'd tell me I was wasting the board's time." He shook his head. "A lot of people in that room know numbers. Not many of them think about the bigger picture. If you're going to be part of this, you can't lose that perspective." It was in those car rides, away from the scrutiny of relatives and staff, that Eleanor began to see another side of him. He wasn't warm, but there was a respect forming, one that came from seeing her as someone capable of carrying weight rather than as someone to be shielded or controlled. Grace noticed the change too. Her daughter came home later now, carrying folders and spreadsheets instead of cleaning supplies. At night, Eleanor would sit at the kitchen table, studying business terminology and reading through case studies. Grace never interrupted, but sometimes she would linger nearby, making tea and glancing over the pages as if trying to understand this new world Eleanor was stepping into. One evening, Charles appeared at the cottage door unexpectedly. Grace answered, her surprise masked by her usual composure. "I'm here for Eleanor," he said. "She's in the back," Grace replied. "Studying." When Eleanor came forward, he handed her a slim leather portfolio. "There's an internship program for young partners' heirs. It's usually reserved for those already inside the family circle. I want you in it." She hesitated. "Isn't that going to cause more trouble?" He gave a short, humorless laugh. "Everything about you causes trouble to them. But you're not here to make them comfortable. You're here to learn." The internship was demanding. It placed her in rotating departments within the firm: finance, acquisitions, legal, and even philanthropy. It wasn't glamorous. Her first week was spent sorting through decades of old contracts, but it was immersive. She learned the small details that kept the company running and met employees who cared little for her last name but paid attention to how quickly she adapted. It was in the philanthropy department that she found something unexpected. A stack of pending proposals sat on the director's desk, one of them from a community center in her own town. They were requesting funding for a scholarship program aimed at children from low-income families, the same kind of opportunity she had once wished for herself. The proposal was buried under more profitable ventures, but Eleanor pulled it aside. When she asked the director about it, she was told there wasn't enough budget for programs with limited visibility. Eleanor didn't let it drop. She brought the proposal to Charles that evening, laying it on his desk. "They're asking for less than the cost of a board dinner," she said. "It's not about profit. It's about doing something that matters." Charles studied her for a moment, then leaned back. "You're asking me to approve it outside the usual process. I'm asking you to show them this company can see beyond its own walls." The next week, the funding was approved. Eleanor didn't tell the community center who had pushed it through, but she kept a copy of the signed grant in her desk. her growing involvement in the firm began to ripple through the estate as well. Some staff still regarded her with suspicion, but others started to seek her out, not for gossip, but for small requests, advice, or just to share updates. She listened to them, the way she wished more people had listened to her mother over the years. Grace, while proud, kept a measured distance from the new role her daughter was stepping into. One night, as they walked back from the main house after a brief visit with Charles, she spoke quietly. "Don't let their world change the way you see people," she said. "It's easy to forget what's real when the rooms get bigger and the voices get louder." Eleanor nodded. "I won't. I promise." Still, the resistance hadn't vanished. Meredith continued to circulate rumors, Edward lobbied for restrictions on her authority, and Simon made a pointed comment in a quarterly meeting about inexperienced members being liabilities. Eleanor didn't respond to the jab. She'd learned that silence could be more cutting than argument. One cold evening in December, Charles invited her to his study. A fire burned low, casting flickering shadows across the shelves. On his desk was a single sheet of paper. "This is the preliminary notice for next year's board elections," he said. "There's a seat opening for a voting member. I want you to take it." Eleanor stared at him. "That's a real seat? With actual power?" "Yes," he said simply. "And it will be contested. They'll fight it. But I've watched you handle worse in the past months." She took the paper, reading the requirements. "If I do this, there's no going back." "You've never been the type to go back," Charles replied. That night, Eleanor sat in her room with the notice in her hands. She thought of her father's journal, her mother's years of endurance, the orchard she'd walked since childhood, and the people in the community center whose lives might change because of one decision she had fought for. By the time the fire in the cottage stove burned down to embers, she knew her answer. The morning of the board election was cold enough to frost the windows, but inside the Beaumont estate there was a heat that had nothing to do with the weather. The tension had been building for weeks. Eleanor's candidacy for the open voting seat had drawn clear battle lines within the family and the firm. Charles had publicly endorsed her, which meant her opposition had mobilized just as publicly to stop her. Eleanor arrived early at the firm's headquarters in the city, her hair tied back neatly, wearing a tailored navy suit that Charles had insisted she have custom-made. Grace had wanted to come for support, but Eleanor told her it was better if she stayed away from the politics of the day. "I need you to be the safe place I come back to," she had said that morning. The boardroom was already filling when she entered with Charles. Conversations hushed for a beat before resuming in low murmurs. She felt every pair of eyes on her, but she walked to her seat with steady steps, placing her folder neatly on the polished table. Meredith was there, her expression as unreadable as ever, flanked by Edward and Simon. Across the room, younger members of the board offered her small nods, quiet signs of solidarity. The agenda was read aloud, and the election moved to the top of the list. Charles opened the floor with a short statement: "The role of a voting member is not ceremonial. It requires diligence, insight, and the courage to act when the easy choice would be silence. I believe Eleanor has all three." Meredith responded almost immediately. "While we all respect your opinion, Charles, it's worth noting that experience should outweigh sentiment. Eleanor has been with the firm for less than a year." Eleanor didn't let him answer for her. "That's true," she said evenly. "But in that time, I've identified overlooked opportunities that have increased community engagement by measurable margins. I've also raised concerns that saved us from what would have been a public relations disaster in the Greenfield acquisition. I may not have decades in this room, but I've proven I know how to protect both our interests and our integrity." There was a pause before another board member spoke, a man in his 60s with a sharp gaze. "And what do you see as the firm's greatest weakness right now?" Eleanor met his eyes without hesitation. "Fear of change. This company was built on bold decisions. Somewhere along the way, that turned into guarding what we have instead of building what we could become." A murmur swept the table. Even those opposed to her shifted slightly at the directness of her answer. The vote was called. Each member cast their ballot silently, placing it in a silver box at the center of the table. The secretary tallied the results at the far end of the room while the board waited in tense quiet. When she returned, she handed the slip to the chairperson, who announced, by a majority vote, the new board member is Eleanor Grace Myers. There was a scattering of polite applause, some genuine, some not. Meredith's smile was thin enough to cut glass, but she offered a cool, "Congratulations." Eleanor nodded once. "Thank you." On the ride back to the estate, Charles was uncharacteristically quiet. He didn't congratulate her, didn't offer advice, didn't dissect the meeting. He simply drove, his hands steady on the wheel. It wasn't until they pulled into the long driveway lined with bare trees that he spoke. "You know," he said, "when I first saw you in that study months ago, I thought I was testing you. I thought I'd see greed or hesitation or something I could use to define you before you defined yourself." Eleanor turned to face him. "But that's not what I saw," he continued. "When you found that letter, you didn't look at the money. You didn't even look at me. You looked at the words like they were the only thing in the room that mattered. And then you whispered something, just one word." Her throat tightened. "You heard me. I didn't just hear it. I saw it. The way you held that paper, the way your shoulders stiffened. You said, 'Father.' Not in a way that asked a question, but in a way that said you already knew. And I realized then that my test had been pointless. The truth wasn't about whether you could resist temptation. It was about whether I could face what I'd spent years avoiding." They sat in silence for a moment before he added, "I wasn't ready to see my brother in you. But I did. And I see him more every day now." Eleanor looked out the window at the orchard, the branches stark against the winter sky. "I'm not him," she said softly. "No," Charles agreed. "You're you. And that's why you'll do more for this name than either of us ever could." When they reached the cottage, Grace was waiting by the door. Eleanor stepped out of the car and, for the first time, felt the weight of the day lift, not because she had won, but because she had faced them all without bending. Charles remained in the driver's seat for a moment longer, watching her greet her mother. Then he drove back toward the main house alone, the image of his niece standing in the cold, her head held high, burned into his mind. Later that night, he poured himself a glass of whiskey in the study and looked at the photograph of his brother that still sat on the bookshelf. "She's nothing like me," he murmured to it. "But she's everything like you." And for once, the thought didn't bring him regret. It brought him peace. Because now, he knew the legacy was in the right hands.